is off to a great start for the New England Council. I wanted to begin by thanking our friends at BAE Systems, represented this morning by Tom Bishop, for graciously sponsoring today's program. You all know that BAE is one of the Granite State's largest employers, an incredible corporate citizen throughout our region. They are a longtime council member, and we are truly grateful for their support today, but more importantly for their ongoing engagement in the New England Council. Today kicks off a very busy lineup of events in the next couple of weeks. Here in New England, we'll be hosting events with Senator Angus King in Maine on Monday, as well as the Labor Secretary, Marty Walsh, and the Mayor of Boston, Michelle Wu. And in Washington, D.C., we look forward to hosting two other members of the New Hampshire delegation, Senator Maggie Hassan and Representative Annie Custer, at events in February. And as always, you can find more information and register for these events on our website, newenglandcouncil.com. Today, we're delighted to welcome back the representative for New Hampshire's 1st Congressional District, Chris Pappas. Congressman was just sworn in to his 3rd term after winning re-election last fall. In his first 2 terms on Capitol Hill, he's established himself as a champion, not just for the great Granite State, but for the entire New England region. From working with his colleagues in the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee to advance historic investments in improving our nation's roads, bridges, and water infrastructure, to advocating for better services for our nation's veterans, the Congressman has proven himself to be an effective leader for the region. Needless to say, we're pleased he could join us today to talk about his priorities for the 118th Congress and the evolving political landscape on Capitol Hill. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable United States Representative Chris Pappas.
Jim, thanks very much. You're always very generous with the introductions. I appreciate it, and you certainly have a full dance card, so best of luck with all those meetings and sessions that you have with the New England delegation. We're a delegation that continues to punch above its weight. Even though we have no members of the majority in the House, I think we'll continue to find ways to get a New England spin and a New Hampshire spin on legislation that's coming through. And good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. Great to be with you. Thank you to Sheila and the folks at St. Anselm for hosting us here today. Give my best to Neil. I know he's off at another meeting this morning, or he'd be here. I think the last time I was in this room was for a debate in early November on WMUR. Neil was a great host that evening. I hope today is a little bit less adversarial than that particular day was, but who knows with this crowd. And I'm interested to hear your questions and thoughts. That's always the most important part of the event. For me, I'll give you a little bit of a sketch at the opening, and then we'll open it up to some questions. And I just thank you for what you all do individually to make New Hampshire just such a great place to do business, to call home. We continue to be a state that is attractive in every metric you can imagine, and it doesn't happen by accident. It's because we're the kind of state with the sort of scale where people know each other, they work together, it's collaborative. And I think that spirit is alive and well right here, and I thank the New England Council for convening this event here today. So Congress got off to an interesting start, to say the least. I began my 3rd term on January 3rd, and boy, was that a long week. I thought I'd have more responsibilities beyond just sitting in my seat and popping up every now and then and saying the word Jeffries, but that's what the first few days entailed in Washington until we finally got a speaker. So we don't have committee assignments yet. That process is still moving forward through both caucuses, but we expect to be named to committees perhaps next week or the following week. So things are a little bit delayed in terms of getting Congress set up and getting the business of the people moving forward. I hope that what we saw the first week in January doesn't foreshadow gridlock in Congress for the next 2 years, but I have a feeling that at least those 20 individuals that were involved in hijacking the process on Organization Day probably have some other thoughts about how the place should be run. So I think things are going to be difficult moving forward. And you know the stakes as good as anyone else in terms of what this means for our budget and appropriations, for the debt ceiling negotiations. And let me just say a bit about that. We've seen throughout the last couple decades, I think since the Gingrich era, this has been used as kind of a tool to extract demands and to extract concessions from the president or from the Senate or the House, depending on how the negotiations go. And I expect we're going to see some negotiations happening. I'm part of a bipartisan problem solvers group that's made up of half Republicans and half Democrats. This is priority number 1, 2, and 3 for us. We expect to convene a working group. I think there's great interest among the moderate Republicans that are there in the House to find a workable solution so that we avoid the cataclysm that would be defaulting on the debt, soiling the full faith and credit of the United States, unleashing a global economic catastrophe, and seeing millions of jobs lost here in the United States. This country can't afford it. And I think it would be reckless for people to push the envelope too far into June when we know these extraordinary measures will exhaust themselves and will be up against the brink. So I think the time is now. I've been encouraged to hear from my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that talks and negotiations are happening with increasing speed. And so I think there is an opportunity to settle this before this hangs out there for too long. We have other important business that we have to get to as well. And I think for a moment, I'd just like to reflect on what happened in the last Congress. I think this was a period of bipartisanship unlike any other in recent memory. When you look at some of the big ticket items that passed through Congress, a bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Act, the PACT Act for veterans, millions of veterans that are going to get access to care who have been exposed to toxic substances, postal reform that was done. At the very end of the year, we did marriage equality legislation in a bipartisan fashion. Those were the hallmarks of the last Congress. I think it speaks to the ability of people still to come together and solve problems. And frankly, I think that's what the message that voters were sending from November was in the last election. Voters were rejecting extremist candidates across the country. They were insisting that Republicans and Democrats find a path to solve problems and work together. It doesn't mean we have to agree all the time. Certainly we won't. But at the end of the day, we've got to get the people's business done. And I think we have a track record of having done that in the last Congress. And despite the leadership change in the House and what we saw during the first week, I'm going to stay as optimistic as I can because I know that there are problem solvers on both sides of the aisle who are really committed to addressing these issues. I was up in the Mount Washington Valley yesterday talking with business owners, talking with veterans. I even took a couple runs at Attitash, and by the way, the ski conditions are better than you might expect, and they're looking at a few inches of snow tonight, so that's good news. But up there and all across our state, we know the challenges in our economy. High electric rates, high energy costs, a housing crunch, a workforce shortage. As someone who comes out of the restaurant business, we haven't seen this tight a labor market in at least a half a century. We know we're contending with inflation that continues to be unbearable for families and businesses, especially when it comes to energy costs, which has the cyclical effect of driving inflation even further. So we've got some work to do on that front. One issue that I'll mention that we've taken the lead on, and it's been a little bit frustrating that under presidents of both parties, we haven't made more progress, but this is on worker visas and immigration. I was talking to a few folks earlier about the immigration challenges that we face. We obviously have a crisis on the southern border, and the only winners in that crisis right now are the cartels. And we've got to take additional steps to make sure that our border is secure, but we can't take our eye off the ball when it comes to finding a path forward for comprehensive immigration reform. That is the only way the United States is going to continue to be a world-leading economy, that our country is going to continue to grow, that we're going to meet the needs of our businesses and communities moving forward. And so a small step would be farm worker modernization legislation, which we've passed in the House that I hope we can jumpstart again this Congress, and reforming the H-2B and J-1 programs so that there's more capacity to support the needs of our seasonal businesses in particular. These are businesses that can't hire locally to help manage the high demand that they're experiencing right now. And those programs are a lifeline, but as with most things in Washington, they can be complicated, burdensome, bureaucratic, and so they need to be modernized and have more capacity to meet the needs of our businesses and economy moving forward. With respect to housing, there are some great conversations happening at the local and state level. We have some important tools from the federal level that are on the table in terms of tax credits and community development block grants and other things that are used by developers, but we really need a whole-of-government approach to solve this problem. And again, this is something that is driving inflation and holding our state back. We're about 20,000 units short of where we need to be in terms of addressing the housing crunch that New Hampshire faces right now. And to solve that problem would go a long way to securing a bright economic future for New Hampshire to ensure that we can compete, especially when it comes to retaining and attracting the young people that we need to fuel our economy for the future. So without committee assignments, I can't speak in great detail about legislative efforts that we'll see on specific committees, but I expect to be named to the Transportation and Veterans Affairs Committees once again. With transportation, you'll remember that we got the bipartisan infrastructure law passed and signed into law in December of last year, so it's been in place for more than a year now. We've seen important benefits flowing to New Hampshire in terms of the formula funding. If you look at the Exit 4A project, for instance, right off of 93, that first phase is underway. I was there with Mitch Landrieu not too long ago, who's sort of the infrastructure czar in the White House. And that project and so many others across our state are benefiting from the formula funding in terms of increased dollars to New Hampshire for the highway program. That's allowed projects to be expedited. It's allowed more projects to go on to the 10-year plan. So that's good news for New Hampshire. We're also seeing a significant boost in terms of water and sewer infrastructure, money coming for broadband projects that the state is figuring out how to disperse. And on top of all that, and where we're really going to focus the next term, is helping communities with these discretionary grant opportunities that are available. Manchester recently received a significant grant to help improve connections in the Mill Yard area. There are other opportunities in the bill that are out there for communities, and we stand ready to assist the 75 towns in my district with any opportunities that are in that bill. With respect to veterans, I chaired the Oversight Subcommittee for VA in the last term. We'll see how that shakes out this time, but there is important oversight work when it comes to managing and providing the care and feeding of the PACT Act. It's one thing to pass a bill. That's the easy part. The hard part is actually scaling up VA so that it can handle the millions of veterans that are going to seek care for conditions related to toxic exposure. And so that's the challenge of the next Congress. And in talking with veterans up north yesterday, we have to continue to recognize the fact that there are many vets that don't seek care in the VA. They also happen to have a higher incidence of suicide and struggle with other issues. And we know that a lot of rural veterans just don't have the transportation or access to care that they need. And so making sure that we're protecting our community clinics and that we're continuing to usher in the transition to telehealth is going to be really important for New Hampshire veterans and patients of all stripes to make sure that they get access to the care that they need. So there's a lot of other issues on the table. I'm sure we'll get into a little bit of that with the question and answers today. But just thank you for what you all do. I'm thrilled to be back for another term. I don't think anyone served 3 terms in a row in this district in like 20 years or something. So this is a little bit unheard of. I'm really pleased to have earned the confidence of the folks in New Hampshire. And I recognize that I was reelected not just by members of my own party. This continues to be a moment where we have to work to push partisanship aside and put the country first. I think New Hampshire shows how we can do that time and again, and we need a little bit more of that common sense in Washington, D.C., and that's what I hope to reflect. But I look forward to continuing to learn from you all today and over the next 2 years. And Jim, why don't we open up to some questions if folks are ready?
Okay.
Thanks.
I should mention that you were very instrumental in securing $2.5 million for this wonderful college here for the new nursing facility that I think will also benefit your constituents in the greater Manchester area. So congratulations on that. And also talk about some of your accomplishments. You omitted the advocacy that you were able to deliver millions of dollars in mental health under the budget. And obviously under COVID, that has spiked up so much, but you got some good news there and additional funding for your communities here.
Sure. No, thanks for mentioning it, and we were pleased to be able to work with St. Anselm on this congressional directed spending. These are the things that used to be known as earmarks, but we don't call them that anymore. It's the ability of members of Congress to identify projects that are worthwhile, and this one is a workforce-related project to help expand a nursing program here at St. Anselm, and we're really pleased to be able to secure that funding and look forward to that succeeding. This is an issue that is so important for our workforce. And as we think about health care in New Hampshire, we know that our hospitals, our providers are under great stress right now. We've got to make sure that we have a young contingent of health care staff that's ready to go. So thank you for your partnership on that. But with respect to mental health, obviously, we are continuing to face a crisis here in New Hampshire. I was speaking actually with Justice Broderick just earlier this week about his efforts over the last 6 years or so with his very public-facing campaign in New Hampshire, going into high schools. He said he's probably hugged more high school students in New Hampshire than anyone else in the Granite State over the last 6 years because he sees a generation that is ready to open up but has experienced so much trauma and so much dislocation in their lives, and it is weighing on their mental health. We continue to lack the resources in terms of the clinical staff, in terms of the facilities, in terms of the outlets for young people and people of all ages in New Hampshire to get the help they need. We know that we have seen disinvestment over a period of decades in terms of our community-based mental health system in New Hampshire, but we're going to continue to look for opportunities to help supplement the state dollars with federal funding that can help hire up the workforce that we need, help make sure that people can get care in a community near them. And we've also heard that telehealth has made a big difference throughout the pandemic. We're committed to, seeing this transition through and making sure that the temporary changes that were made for COVID are made permanent so that telehealth can continue to be there and be a really game-changing tool for our providers.
When one looks at the first week of Congress and seeing that it took 14 ballots to elect a speaker, one would think that it's pretty much of a perfunctory process just to elect a leader. There are some people who think this may be a preview of turmoil in the next 6 months, in particular in funding for aid to Ukraine, funding for the Pentagon. Our friend Congressman Jim McGovern is concerned about food stamp reauthorization of the farm bill that we do every 5 years, and that's up in September. Do you have any assurance from your colleagues that they're going to address these issues, or are these going to be tumultuous issues to deal with?
Well, I think it could be tumultuous, but we really have to see how this plays out, and I think there's a responsibility for every member of Congress to insist that we get the people's business done. It shouldn't be that just a handful of members can hold up something as important as an appropriations bill, the defense bill, or raising the debt limit. Now, we do have an opportunity, I think, in this Congress to look at how in this post-COVID era, where we've taken on trillions of dollars of new debt, find ways to be more fiscally responsible. I think there's a great audience on both sides of the aisle to do that. But we can do it without brinksmanship. We can do it through regular order. We can do it by improving the budgeting process. And so that's where I think those of us who are sort of in the pragmatic center are going to be looking to go. But you're absolutely right. Some of what the Freedom Caucus was asking for, I think, will be a non-starter, $75 billion worth of defense cuts. That just would be unpalatable. I think we had a great success passing an omnibus bill on a bipartisan basis in December. Thankfully, we got that done because if that got kicked to January or February, we'd be in a situation right now where we'd be wrangling over whether or not we could keep the government open. And I think that would be a tough first test for this new House to be able to pass. But I think with time we can build that confidence and build those bipartisan relationships. So I'm staying optimistic, but it's going to take some time.
Just getting back to the budget stalemate, there are some of your colleagues that are at least talking. One way to address the stalemate is maybe the discharge. And the discharge, basically, you can explain it better than me, but it would take 218 members to sign a petition stating that they want this bill to come to the floor. The bill would go to a committee for like 30 days and then it'd be acted upon. But obviously, you'd need 6 Republicans in order to support the discharge. But my question is, again, is that an issue that is percolating with some of your colleagues that might resolve the issue?
Well, I think it could. It's one avenue, but I think it is probably more of a break glass in case of emergency kind of a tool that we have at our disposal. So I think for now, we're going to rely on working groups and other sort of ad hoc combinations of members of Congress to help get this conversation going. And I think, frankly, we just can't rely on leadership to do it. There were many times in the last Congress where I regretted the fact that Speaker Pelosi wanted to do Democrats-only legislation and didn't want to engage with Republicans. And I think at the outset, we're probably going to see the same from Speaker McCarthy. He's going to work to please those who voted for him for Speaker, would be hesitant about engaging with Democratic members. And so I think at the member level, that's where these conversations have to happen. And I've been optimistic about what I've heard so far, but the devil's in the details. It's going to take some time. But that is something that is available to us. It's a discharge petition, which would be a majority of members of the House of either party could sign a discharge petition to get a specific piece of legislation onto the floor. I haven't seen that in my time in Congress, so it's rare that it happens. But I think when you're talking about something like the debt limit, we've already heard a few Republicans commit to supporting a discharge petition. So that means if the Senate could come up with legislation, we could introduce it in the House, get a majority to sign a discharge petition and get it on the floor. I think that's something that we'll keep in our back pocket as the talks and negotiations happen.
One of the rules that Speaker McCarthy gave to some of his colleagues who are on the fence was that one member could make a motion to discharge, in other words, to bring down the speaker if he or she feels that he is going in a different direction. There are some people that think that is going to cause problems for him and his leadership going forward. Your thoughts on having one member having that ability?
Well, I think the rule change gets the House back to where it was a period of years ago. That predates my time there. But again, I think the Speaker has sort of walked this high wire act. He was able to get to 218, or I guess he didn't even get to 218, he got to 216 with some people voting present and not going on record, voting one way or the other. But this will be a challenge for him. I would expect at some point in time, those folks who insisted on that one vote motion to vacate the chair will try to bring up that issue, and then we'll have a vote. And I think, people on both sides of the aisle will have to think long and hard about the implications of doing that. And I wouldn't want to commit to voting one way or the other, even though I didn't vote for Speaker McCarthy. I think you have to think about what's best for the institution, what's best for the country, what's best in terms of the work that's left to do ahead of us. So I think we might see that happen at some point in time. It hasn't been attempted any time in recent history, but that's an extraordinary step.
You've reintroduced legislation, trust in Congress. Can you talk about that and why it's needed?
Sure. So we've got a bill that we had hoped would be brought up last session. It never was, because I think the powers that be decided they like the system the way it is. But this is legislation that would ban members of Congress from owning or trading individual stocks. And we do have laws that exist today. The Stock Act is in place, but there are significant violations of this, which I think erodes public trust in the institution, in our federal government entirely. And so this legislation would look to create bright lines, would require members to put their assets in terms of stocks in a blind trust, so that we send a clear signal that we're serving the public and not serving ourselves. And I think that's an important step that we can take. So this, again, is bipartisan. I think folks who have been around a while don't like it, frankly. But that's okay. I mean, I think it's important to bring up a good government idea like this. And I think if you had a vote on it, I think we could get it through the House. The question is what would happen in the Senate after that. But I think there continues to be great interest on that legislation. We introduced it last week, and we're going to look for a hearing and continue to raise heck about it.
You've also reintroduced legislation to protect the strategic petroleum from being sold to some of our foreign adversaries. Can you talk about why that is necessary right now?
Sure. Well, there was a lot said as the Biden administration took steps to tap the strategic reserve, which frankly I think was an important step to do whatever we could to help relieve pressures at the pump and lower prices. I think in retrospect it looked like a good move because we did see some relief. I think they estimated 35 cents or so relief at the pump as a result of these sales from the strategic reserve. But there is concern that some of these sales went to nations like China that are adversaries. And so we passed legislation, bipartisan legislation last week that the Republican conference brought up that would prevent and prohibit these sales from going to China. But that really deals with a small fraction of concerns around global energy. I, for one, would like to get back to a point where we're meeting the needs of homeowners and businesses here in New England first before we're seeing our energy exported to other parts of the world. And one of the things that I've learned is that our strategic reserve of home heating oil in New England is woefully inadequate to meet the need. If we were to tap it, it could provide about a day or two worth of home heating oil for folks in New England. So we need greater resiliency to make sure that we have the resources in case of an emergency or an event where we needed to access it. So the legislation would look to evaluate our strategic reserves when it comes to home heating oil, gas, and other energy resources, and make sure, at least on a regional basis, that we're well equipped to face down any sort of emergency that might arise.
And then a local issue, and that's the DNC has, under the bylaws and the Rules Committee has indicated that they've recommended that we reorder the primary system, that South Carolina go first, New Hampshire, and then Nevada. And what are you hearing from your colleagues in Washington and members of the DNC, and how firm they are in keeping that order?
Yeah. Well, Jim Clyburn is a happy guy based on what the president recommended, but I am quite upset with what the president did, and I think what I hear from folks in New Hampshire ranges from bewilderment to true anger over his decision to recommend that the DNC upend the calendar and move other primary states ahead of New Hampshire. So it's an unworkable plan. What the Democratic Party in New Hampshire has communicated to the DNC is that you're asking New Hampshire to do something that will never and can never happen. They're asking and putting stipulations in there that New Hampshire would have to change its laws with respect to early voting, something that our Republican legislature doesn't want to do. Democrats might be interested in that issue, but it's not going to happen before the DNC takes this issue up on February 3rd, I believe. So we feel that we've got a great argument to make. We've seen these challenges before, and we've made the argument successfully. The fact is there should have been an opportunity for like a win-win here. If Democrats truly wanted to abandon the Iowa caucuses, we could have just let everyone slide up one slot. New Hampshire would have its first primary, and then we would see the other states happen in succession, Nevada, South Carolina, and add another state from the Midwest into the mix, Michigan. But it appears that the president had other ideas, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense because the New Hampshire primary is an institution that's been around for more than a century. It is bigger than any one political party. It's bigger than any one president. And the appearance here, and I'll give the president the benefit of the doubt that this is just appearance, is that he's trying to make things easier for his reelection, that he doesn't want New Hampshire to be the leadoff state. He wants a sure thing in being able to go to South Carolina. What we've been saying is that you should trust the voters of New Hampshire. We just had a midterm election where Democrats did better than the expectations. And he should show up here and make the case to New Hampshire voters, and I think they would give him a fair shake. So I think it's very unfortunate that this has been recommended, but I think New Hampshire has the ultimate checkmate in the end, which is our state law, and we're going to follow our state law and make sure that we go ahead of any similar contest, regardless of what the DNC does. This has never been about delegates. It's always been about the quality of the conversations that we have all across our state. And it doesn't mean that we decide for the rest of the country. And that's one thing that sometimes I hear from colleagues is, well, why should New Hampshire, pick presidents? Shouldn't everyone else have a shot at it? Well, what we've seen in recent history is that other states do have a significant shot, and New Hampshire doesn't have a great track record when it comes to actually choosing winners that end up in the White House. But what we have is intimate conversations that add value to the process. We always talk about this issue of the opioid epidemic, which we identified here in New Hampshire before many other states did, and the impression that those personal conversations left on folks in 2012 and 2016, I think made a difference at lifting up awareness nationally and focusing attention and dollars on addressing that issue. That's just one example, I think, of how New Hampshire can make a difference. And so we're proud of that tradition. This is ground zero right here of the New Hampshire primary, and it will continue to be the case. And we're going to continue to fight for it.
Questions for the congressman? We have a few minutes left. Otherwise, I'll keep. Becca Gould. We have a microphone here from one of the students.
For the students?
From the student.
Oh, thank you.
Like a student.
I thought that was the best compliment I'd get all week. Anyway, I'm Becca Gould. As you know, I work for American Tower. Congratulations on your third term. I didn't know that. That's a big deal. I didn't know the history in New Hampshire. That's a big deal. So what I'd like you to address a little bit more is broadband for rural areas. So thank you for your work. And today I'm here with United South End Settlements, another good New England Council member who has a camp that serves underprivileged children from Boston to come up to New Hampshire in the summer, and they were having a little problems getting wired, and so we really appreciate you and your team's efforts on helping make that happen. But what do you see kind of generally on the funding flowing, and how's it going for rural areas?
Well, I think legislative efforts have set us up for an era where we have the opportunity to achieve universal broadband access in New Hampshire. We see about 10% of our residents that lack broadband because of a lack of infrastructure, many others who can't afford a subscription, some who just have one service provider in their area, and sometimes that can be cost prohibitive. So we have to address both sides of the equation, and both through the American Rescue Plan and the infrastructure law, we did that. New Hampshire's, I think, received a couple tranches of money from those bills already. They're hard at work to contract out those funds and figure out how to fill in the gaps. We've got a lot of last miles in our state, as you know, especially in rural areas and in underserved areas in northern New Hampshire. So that's where the focus has been, and we're going to continue to find other resources if need be, but I think these dollars are going to go a long way to closing that gap. And there's also the affordability component in the legislation that allows folks to get technology, to get an internet subscription if they can't afford it. We experienced this through the pandemic where we realized how important getting online is. It's akin to rural electrification at the beginning of the last century. And for kids, for patients, for folks who want to participate in commerce or access local government, they need to be able to get online. And so this is an essential issue for New Hampshire, not a luxury anymore. And I think we are taking some important steps forward. So we thank you for your work on that issue. And it's great to hear about how the camp got wired. And we look forward to getting up there for the ribbon cutting.
Other questions? Robert, just wait for the mic.
Good morning. So we've heard that one of the concessions that Speaker McCarthy apparently made was a vote on junking the current tax system and replacing it with a European-style VAT. And do you think that's actually going to happen? And if it doesn't, if he resists that because it seems very problematic in terms of how that actually would occur, do you think there's going to be a lot of pushback from this group that really wants to do that?
I can't imagine that's going to get much legs, but I saw the same reports you did. There's a member who has sponsored legislation for a 30% value-added tax that allegedly is going to get a vote on the bill. We'll see. Doesn't mean that there's majority support for the bill, because I can't imagine that there would be. At a time of high inflation, to institute a tax that would be incredibly burdensome for low and middle income Americans is just something that I can't see moving forward. But we'll watch it. And we're learning more every day about some of the concessions that McCarthy negotiated as part of his deal to become Speaker. And I think it's important that members know what he signed on the dotted line for. Even members of his own conference didn't know what he had agreed to, and I think that's a little bit extraordinary. Again, he certainly had to walk a tight wire act to get the votes he needed to become Speaker, and it's kind of a house of cards at this point. But I hope for the stability of the institution that it can be successful, that we can be successful at continuing some of the bipartisan work we got done in the last Congress, and that individual members will have more power to be able to work with each other and get legislation to the floor. But that's something that I think is just not going to go anywhere.
We have another student here.
Oh, great.
Joanne?
Lifelong learners.
It's like we're in a seminar together. Thank you. Joanne Sullivan from the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston, and thank you, Congressman, for being here, and also congratulations on being reelected to a third term. In your comments about transportation and then the wish to be on that committee again, one of the things we're seeing in our affordable housing work is efforts to site affordable housing nearer to transportation nodes, whether they be rail or trail or bus. Could you talk a little bit about how the infrastructure bill and other elements might work towards that, so that people can actually live a little bit closer to the ways in which they get to work?
Well, thanks for the question and for your work. And clearly, we need to build toward a more sustainable intermodal future. We just can't keep widening the interstates. And when you look at especially a younger demographic who, in many cases, people want walkable, bikeable communities. They don't want to own cars. We see a lot of development happening in Manchester right now, hundreds and hundreds of new units going into the downtown area, which I think is representative of somewhat of a trend. And we've got to make sure we have the transportation that both will support that trend, but also, continue to push it forward. So in addition to the funding that's coming for highways, there's significant resources available for transit, for rail expansion. This is an issue that New Hampshire continues to look at and kick around. It appears the Executive Council pulled the plug on a federal study that was ongoing on the Capital Corridor project, but there are other opportunities if there's the political will to move forward and take advantage of some of the funding that's on the table for rail for New Hampshire. We've taken the lead on active transportation, rail trail funding, that will help support walkable, bikeable communities. There are very limited resources available for bike pedestrian infrastructure, but we know that many of our communities are really interested in these projects as a way to create local connections, improve quality of life, and there's also an economic component to it as well. So we were able, working with Senator Markey, to get in the infrastructure law a new grant program for active transportation. It was funded in the appropriations bill at the end of the year. So there are going to be some grant opportunities that we'll work with communities in New Hampshire on for active transportation. So it's not just about rebuilding what we've got. It's about being smart and thinking for the future, understanding how these different modes can connect. And I think New Hampshire has a long way to go to support other modes of transportation. I also mentioned the airport, which is a great asset for our state, an economic engine. We're looking at FAA reauthorization in the next Congress, so I hope if I'm back on the committee to be working closely. I don't see him here, Ted Kitchens. He's usually at these breakfasts, but he's probably dealing with a system outage or something like that. They've been through a lot in aviation. And we've got a ways to go to modernize systems there and make sure FAA and our airports are positioned for the future. But it's about making sure these different modes connect, and that creates the conditions for investments in things like housing. But we also need communities that are going to be looking at their zoning, are going to be modernizing for the future, are welcoming the kind of development that supports our workforce, that supports middle-class families in New Hampshire. Thanks.
Tim? Can you just wait for the mic? So, just identify yourself.
Yes. Hi, Rich Tatro. First time attendee at a New England Council session. I'm really enjoying it. Thank you.
There you go.
I'm with HNTB, an engineering firm that has an office in Concord. I hail from the other side of the Connecticut River, and I want to thank you for showing a new Representative Ballant the ropes in the Congress, so thank you very much. Continuing with the transportation theme, my history was 31 years with the Vermont Agency of Transportation and now in the private sector. Thank you very much for all that you've done with IIJA. Let's assume for a minute you do get back on the Transportation Committee. I'm interested if you could share any policy or programmatic issues that you think should be tackled next. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the question, and I think you get a free T-shirt from Jim for this being your first New England Council meeting or something. That's great. Well, welcome, and thanks for crossing the river for this. You're a new member of Congress in Vermont. Vermont's actually the last state to elect their first woman to Congress, so now every state has elected a woman to Congress, which is an important milestone, and she'll be terrific. But I think some of the issues that I've mentioned, I'll just restate. FAA reauthorization is the big one for our committee. Again, a lot happening in the aviation space. I think we will see on a lot of committees in the House, the Republicans try to be pushing the administration and be pretty aggressive against secretaries as they come before our committees, and I would expect that Secretary Buttigieg will see a lot of fire from the minority, and that's just to kind of set the stage of where I think the Congress might be going. But again, FAA reauthorization, implementation of IIJA, which, as you know, is a 5-year bill. We had done a lot of patches in previous transportation bills, but this being a more long-range bill allows us to plan, allows us to recalibrate and see how things are going. And so, we're interested in feedback of stakeholders and communities to know where fixes might need to be made along the way. But those are the two big ones as we start out.
A question over here as soon as we get the mic. Our friends from AARP.
Representative Pappas, I wanted to get back to the discussions about the concessions that were made during the road to the speakership, I guess. So there has been talk about the debt ceiling and making changes to Social Security and Medicare a part of those negotiations, a requirement for raising the debt ceiling. I was wondering if you could tell us anything you're hearing about that.
I've only really seen things in media reports and kind of heard members sort of restating what they've heard there. But I think the path that many people are looking at right now is some sort of a commission that gets established that looks at issues around debt and deficit and looks at programs across the board in the federal government, which could include Social Security and Medicare, to come forward and make recommendations. I've got reservations about what some of those recommendations might be, but I don't think it's harmful to the process to have information on the table and have recommendations coming out of a commission if that allows us to get through this process and to ultimately find a way forward to pay the bills. And again, this is just about raising the debt limit, something that used to be pretty rote and mundane, which now has become a political flashpoint. It's not about any new spending. It's just about paying the bills for the spending that has already happened. And there's no reason to risk the full faith and credit of the United States on that. So that's kind of the tenor of what I've heard. But I, for one, would not entertain any specific cuts to programs as a deal for raising the debt limit, because I think people shouldn't be taking hostages with respect to the debt limit. We should be able to be adults and have conversations about a variety of issues, but not threaten the United States of America in that way.
Maybe one final question. Do you think that Congressman George Santos should be expelled.
It's amazing, when I first got elected, I remember Steny Hoyer told a group of us, you'll spend the first couple months wondering how you got there, and then you'll spend the rest of the time wondering how everyone else got there. And I wonder how George Santos got there. Clearly, the media, his opponent, did not put out the information that voters needed to make the right decision, and that's regrettable. And it seems like most voters in his district have buyer's remorse, and they should. The guy's a total fraud, and he's a disgrace to the institution. So I think his past is going to catch up with him really quick. It appears he will have seats on committees, but I think his time in Congress is going to be fairly short in one way or another, whether it's through an investigation that produces results or through his leadership realizing that he's a liability. I can't see him finishing out his term.
Well, we hope you finish out your term.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah. We want to congratulate you on being re-election.
Thanks, Jim.
Second most powerful Democrat.
Yeah. That's great.
We have
Thank
time
you
for
all
a
so
couple of
much.
Pictures. Anyone wants to